Welcome to the First Case Expert Series. We are speaking with Jeff Wertz, our perioperative instrument coordination expert. And I'm your host, Melanie Perry. And today we are going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, preference cards. Jeff, what have you got for us today?
Yeah, I think today we're just going to take some time to really complain.
I like complaining.
And really bitch about them here. So I think...
There's a lot to complain about.
I think it's really critical to at least get everything out in the open of where these challenges arise from. So again, like we've been discussing, there needs to be an understanding of the different perspectives and different inputs that are creating some of these challenges. So I think to kind of get things rolling, like where I always go from a solution standpoint of, developing software and looking at how software can help facilitate some of these things. I want to understand from your perspective as a perioperative leader, like, what has your experience been? Who manages the pref card, and how does that differ between hospitals? So like, maybe let's just start off with that. Like, what have you seen and who's managing it, and then how it gets managed?
Okay. So there's a big answer to that, because I've been in several different facilities and everybody's done something different. In my last facility, it was an academic medical center.
Which is a problem.
Yeah, exactly, right? Consistency would be fantastic. But in my last facility, it was an academic medical center. And so like somebody off in some dungeon somewhere, I've decided, was actually the one creating our preference cards. And we did not have the ability to just create a new card. We had to send off a request to get someone to do it. Somebody who, I think maybe at some point they had worked in the OR sterile processing, so they had some experience and kind of understood the cases we were asking for, but it would take forever. And because we didn't want to wait, I need this pref card, I need to create it, we would just start copying other pref cards because we had that ability. I could just copy another surgeon's pref card and put a new name on it and then done. And then I could go in and change preferences and change information. And so we had copy upon copy upon copy upon copy of pref cards. And sometimes things got carried over correctly, sometimes not. Actually, at my current facility, true to this, we just got a new surgeon, and I was pulling one of his cases, and it was for a proximal humerus fracture. And the preference card had tourniquets on it. I'm like, we don't need a tourniquet for a proximal humerus fracture. Like, this doesn't need to be here. And so like little things sometimes would get missed just because you're copying and pasting. When I first started, just to show my age, our preference cards were on 5x7 note cards. Although the benefit to that was, you had the notes, they were there, and everybody had one that was unique to them. But then also, as I continue this very long answer, whether your pref cards are on 5x7 note cards or they're in the computer, it doesn't matter if they don't stay up to date. And the more people work with surgeons, the more they get comfortable, the more they know, they don't even look at them. I mean, yes, sterile processing is depending on those cards if they're the ones pulling our cases. But if we're not looking at them and we're not updating them because we know what we need, then we're just, I don't know, we're like a cow in the ocean wandering around what we're doing because we don't have the good information that we need.
Well, and I would venture to guess also that you have both of them. You have the EHR's pref card, and then you all have your own cheat sheets that you're working from. Yeah. SPD has their own piece as well. And I think that's, what I heard you say there is essentially like a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Yep.
And I think that's definitely necessary to an extent because you have so many different disparate stakeholders that need to participate in it. Like, we didn't even get to a vendor discussion. So that you're probably thinking more so just like the supplies, the disposables that are required for it. Then you move on to the trays and all of that. And then when you look back at, why that went to the dungeon and you had to go through an entire bureaucratic process was because it's managed in an EHR. So like at a fundamental level within an EHR, they're looking from a systems perspective of how many names do we have for the same procedure? And I think that becomes, foundational is a big challenge for a lot of facilities to understand total knee arthroplasty, total knee replacement. You could have 5 different names for the same thing. And then there's variations on each one of those. Is it, you're doing, partial knee versus a total knee versus a knee revision versus a left versus a right. Those are all the same challenges that the rep has in the field to provide the actual correct equipment for all those things too. Each variation has a downstream effect, and it's very, very complex. So I think that like getting down to a standardized, I guess in using the preferences and in their intended use, there's a couple of different things to consider. Is like actual case setup is probably the most near and dear to your heart. And then you have supply chain that's like, we want to be able to forecast and we want to be able to get all these things. And then you have the device companies, and where I'm coming from, that we want to be able to both make sure that we're prepared for the procedure, but also be able to forecast. And I think that it's ultimately this big tug of war between all these different people and who's managing these. So have you had a positive experience with pref cards, or like what is the most positive experience that you've had in managing these?
Actually, the place that I just made fun of for having a tourniquet on a proximal humerus fracture, they actually have the best pref cards that I have ever seen. And it's a small facility. There's one person who's in charge of doing it. He makes sure that, everything is up to date. And if we see something, we tell him, and it changes immediately. Like it's very quick to get changes made, to get things updated. And that's not the case a lot of times at bigger facilities, because you do have that bureaucratic process, or you have only certain people who are gatekeepers who can actually make those changes. And it's easier just to keep your notes in your notebook and not even worry about the prep card. But one thing that I thought about while you were talking is remembering that prep card, a lot of times in our EHRs, that prep card is what gets pulled into our charting when we're charting our equipment and our implants and our supplies. And so now here we are trying to chart what we actually use. And we have this whole list of things that are completely unnecessary or just not right. And are we actually fixing that while we're charting and doing it correctly? And a lot of times, no, because it takes too much time. So to go back to a negative after I answered with a positive, but you said we got to complain today. And that's a huge one when you're trying to chart and you want to chart quickly, but you can't because you're wading through so many unnecessary items that you didn't use.
Yeah. And to kind of expand on the complaining part of it, we didn't even, we've kind of touched on it for a second, but I think the nurse that's actually setting up the case is using their own note card or whatever they've kind of made makeshift solution that they have to make sure that they're getting it right. But you have SPD that oftentimes doesn't even have access to the EHR to look at. Maybe hopefully they at least have printed off pick lists of what's supposed to be in there based off the EHR. That whole team is also having to do an entire translation there. Is the EHR doesn't take into account traditionally, the most up-to-date name of a set that the SPD uses if they have an instrument tracking system, that they've named those sets, and they don't necessarily correlate. And I think that there's a lot of time that can be spent on that in trying to line those things up or integrating those things. But I think that, again, requires a bigger discussion about who's managing the upkeep of this, because I think I've experienced this a lot in our conversations. And from a software side is, okay, well, if we're going to go through the effort of lining these things up, what's the continued management look like? And that's inevitably where the conversation breaks down, when people realize, oh, this whole thing is really confusing and really messy. And I think that's, the purpose of this, this discussion was to kind of go through some of the messiness of this, but then also to say, all right, once you understand how messy it is at your facility, map that out so that you can then take that to leadership and the other people that are involved with this to say, this is why it's not working. We've got 4 different stakeholders. We have to go through a bureaucratic process. We got to pass a bill, and then we got to take it to Senate, all these different things that are just insane to manage. And I think you need to convey that to leadership and say, hey, this is what will work better for us here. This person gets access, this person gets access, but it has to be well thought out. And to do that, you have to start with where you're at, because it is complex. There are many stakeholders, but until you really codify that at the baseline of where it's at, you're not going to make any progress. And I think that's where a lot of these complex challenges in healthcare inevitably go to die in a lot of senses, because it's going to be complicated. And then they say, well, we want to take into account every contingency, and no one really owns it. And I think the idea that we've been laying out in these conversations is set up some of these collaborative meetings that we're having these discussions on. Not make this too big of a project to begin with, but start with the basics and better understand and communicate on it, so that once you do make a decision, you can start making some actual substantive change within your organization, and have the knowledge, the people that are most knowledgeable, that are closest to it, able to provide feedback that can then support the EHR, whatever those systems engineers are at a hospital, to better design it. Because I think that's where, my experience in this is, you get a lot of people that complain about it, but they haven't taken the time to consider the downstream effects of, if I had it perfectly my way where I always got to update it, and you're not taking into account the standardization that's required on the back end of it to allow for the, you have to get the right naming convention, because if that's thrown off, it's going to throw off all of the reporting on the back end. So you need to have those different perspectives. And I think the more that people that are closest to it have these conversations and really map out more completely for the systems engineers of the EHR or just the manual engineering of this, then you bring in a much more scalable solution to it. And that's where I think we can, kind of take this in the next discussion.
Yes, we'll stop our complaining for today and move on in our next interview to those solutions, because we really could complain all day, but we really want to look at a solution and make it better, because this is something that everyone is frustrated with. So make sure that you join us for our next interview as we continue our conversation with Jeff and talk about the solutions to the issues we have with our prep cards, and find out how we can prevent those downstream negative effects that everyone experiences. So that's all we have for today. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. And thank you all for watching this week's episode of the First Case Expert Series.